Hello, Charles Mercier here. Let's look together at more than one good object from more than just the Greek and Roman galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. In the last video, we looked at lamps, cups, and an inscription that showed us something of the lives of slaves in the ancient world. Let's now look at four objects that allow us to learn something of the lives of freed men and women, enslaved persons who managed to become former slaves, live lives of their own, and celebrate their success after manumission. A slave might never lose the hope of one day coming to life and becoming free and self-determining. From exile, the Latin poet Ovid linked the life of exiles, slaves, prisoners, and people being crucified. Spes facitut vivat fossor quoque compere vinctus, libera qua ferro crura futura putet, carcere di cuntur clausis sperare salutem, at qualiquis pendens in cruce vota facit. Hope makes even a ditch-digging slave bound with shackles go on living and thinking that his legs will one day be free of the iron. Prisoners are said to hope for salvation, and someone hanging on a cross makes vota, that is, desperate prayers and promises to a God that if he escapes, he will give back and dedicate something to the God in return. Freedom from slavery, manumission, could come to a Roman slave in a number of ways. The master could free you for a special act of service or grant you freedom in his will, or you could be allowed to do extra work and build up personal savings, a peculium, and buy your own freedom with it, or buy the freedom of your slave concubine or children. Hope was a pacifier. Offering slaves the possibility of manumission in the future was a Roman social strategy for keeping slaves peaceful and working. A manumitted slave became a client of his former master, who became his patron in the Roman social system of patrons and clients. We've been seeing a Roman marble relief from around the turn of the first millennium CE with two portraits. It's probably a grave relief put up by two prosperous former slaves, a couple who wanted to memorialize themselves and the lives they led after slavery. It's a dignified memorial plaque, unlike this next monument, a funerary altar from the first half of the first century CE, put up to honor two former slaves, Quintus Fabius Diogenes and Fabia Primigenia, by their own freedmen and slaves. Quinto Fabio Diogeni et Fabiae Primigeniae, quae vixit comeo annos quadriginta septem, liberti et libertae et familia Quinti Fabi Diogenes possuerunt. Making it easier to read, Quinto Fabio Diogeni et Fabiae Primigeniae, quae vixit comeo annos quadriginta septem, liberti et libertae et familia Quinti Fabi Diogenes possuerunt. For Quintus Fabius Diogenes and for Fabia Primigenia, who lived with him for 47 years, the freedmen liberti and the freed women libertae, and the household slaves, the familia, of Quintus Fabius Diogenes possuerunt, put up this monument. The long 47 years that Diogenes and Primigenia were together perhaps began when they were both slaves in concubinage and continued through the years after their manumission, when they could have been legally married. Owning and perhaps tyrannizing their own slaves and having freedmen clients of their own was a way for former slaves to feel fully human, fully Roman. To commission this altar, Diogenes has required money of his slaves and clients that they might have wished they could have kept saving or used for their own purposes, like buying their freedom. Maybe he manumitted them in his will. Wealthy former slaves, of course, enjoyed celebrating their prosperity by commissioning expensive monuments to themselves, but they might do this with more enthusiasm than education or discernment. This funeral monument is garish and tasteless. Diogenes repeats his name and tastelessly insists on the slaves he owned. It is decorated with the most grandiose decorations used in the official imperial art of its time. Heavy garlands hanging from rams' heads, and 3 kinds of birds frequent in imperial monuments: the imperial eagle, swans, and songbirds. There is something here of the spirit of the funerary monument the absurd freedman Trimalchio plans for himself in Petronius' Satirica. He instructs the designer of his monument, "I really want you to put at the foot of my statue my dog, and garlands, and jars of perfume, and all the fights of the gladiator Petrites, so that because of your work I may live on after my death. And also the area should be 100 feet wide and 200 feet deep." This is the sort of thing that the Roman ruling classes would make fun of when they mocked the pretensions of a successful former slave. But understandable is the exuberance of freed persons who, when celebrating their freedom and accomplishments, could lose all restraint. Diogenes associated himself with an imperial artistic style. Here in this small altar we meet a freedman, Philetus, with his wife Aurelia Quintiliana, who was proud to identify himself as a former slave in the household of the emperor, at a time of the joint emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, 161 to 169 CE. Making it easier to read, in Victo Deo Serapi et Isidi Reginae, Pilatus Augustorum duorum libertus pro incolumitate sua et Aureliae Quintilianae aurulam combassi et sigilla duo votum libens solvit. To the unconquered god Serapis, and to Isis, queen, Philetus, a freedman, libertus, of the 2 Augusti, the emperors, for his own safety and well-being incolumitate, and that of Aurelia Quintiliana, with this little altar and base and 2 small statues, happily libens fulfilled solvit his votum, vow. This is not a funerary altar, as in the Ovid verse Philetus had made a votum, a vow to make this dedication, perhaps after he and his slave wife had won their freedom or had survived an illness or difficulty. Philetus dedicated this altar and base and 2 statues we do not see to the Egyptian Hellenistic Roman gods Serapis and Isis. Their worship had spread from Hellenistic Egypt all over the Roman Empire. Isis and Serapis had a temple in Rome on the Campus Martius. You won't find this little piece of Roman social and religious history in the Greek and Roman galleries at the Met. In the 1600s, it was built as a support into a Baroque sculpture by François Duquesnoy, a Flemish sculptor working in Rome, who remade fragments of an ancient sculpture into his own version of the god Dionysus on a panther. You'll find it in one of the European painting galleries near paintings by Peter Paul Rubens of Venus and Adonis and a wolf and fox hunt. Finally, this is a painting of a teenager from Roman Egypt, 2nd century CE. He has a Greek name, Eutyches, lucky. He had been a slave of a master called Cassanios, who freed him. That's what an inscription in Greek on the painting tells us, though this one's too hard to make out briefly. So Eutyches is another former slave who came way up in the world. He is wearing a tunic with a distinguished purple stripe. He died young. This is a painting of a kind called a Fayum portrait, which was painted on a wooden panel to be attached to his mummy when he was buried. Roman Egypt was a place where cultures mixed. Mummy portraits were painted in a Roman economy using a Greek painting technique for an Egyptian religious burial purpose. Eutyches escaped slavery for a life he never would lead, but the family and friends who arranged and paid for his mummification and mummy portrait wanted him to have some sort of immortality, which he does for us 2,000 years later. Thanks for watching.